A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
I should probably start by mentioning that my mom had always been a force of nature, a woman whose opinions could make or break the day. I used to look up to her, wanting to wear the same stylish clothes and have the same kind of confidence she exuded, but that changed after last year's family gathering when she casually mentioned I had gained weight over the winter. It wasn't said in a cruel way, but rather in her blunt, unyielding tone that left me reeling. At first, I thought about shrugging it off. After all, taste buds can drive the unwary to indulgence, but as weeks passed, I found myself trapping echoes of her words in the corners of my mind. Fast forward a few months later, we were preparing for my sister's wedding, a grand event that would showcase every family member and friend dressed to the nines. When my mom and I went dress shopping, I could feel anticipation buzzing in my veins, but it was bittersweet. Each dress was lovely, but as the sunlight grazed the mirror, it caught the fickle shadows of self-doubt, and every tug of fabric was accompanied by her scrutinizing gaze. Then came the moment I feared. She picked a stunning red dress and held it out like a trophy, but when I emerged from the dressing room, her reaction was not what I hoped for. "You know, honey, I think something a bit looser would suit you better," she said casually, her thin smile carrying an insidious weight. The words hung over me like a cloud threatening rain, and suddenly, all the mannequins seemed to close in around me, like they were whispering to each other. I felt the heat of shame creep through my cheeks, but something snapped. The soft, timid girl she had raised faded into the background as indignation bloomed. I stood there, heart pounding, and said, "AITA for telling Mom I will buy my own dress after she called me fat?" She blinked as if I had just thrown a glass of cold water in her face, and a shaky silence enveloped us. I turned my back, slipping back into the dressing room, and suddenly the chaos outside felt muffled, almost unreal. I wanted to scream, to cry, but instead, I felt a wave of empowerment wash over me. Why did I care what she thought? I rifled through the cheap dresses on the rack. The gaudy sequins and tearing seams felt welcoming in their imperfection. I tried on a simple emerald green gown that fit me like it was tailored just for me, and when I stepped back into the light, something shifted. The vision of the woman I used to be began to morph into something brand new, something brimming with defiance. I slid into the floor-length skirt, the color wrapping around me like a promise. When I looked in the mirror, the reflection staring back wasn't just a girl burdened by her mother's words, it was a woman ready to make a statement, pursuing her independence, daring to redefine beauty on her own terms, and for the first time in a long while, I gasped with joy. I finally came to realize my worth was not tethered to the fabric my mother handed me, and as I walked back, the emerald dress swaying with each step, I could see the shift in her expression. Her eyes widened, a hint of surprise dancing in the corner of her mouth. "That actually looks lovely," she stammered, and something dark twisted in my gut, mingling anger and reluctant acceptance, as I remembered how her voice pierced through my happiness weeks ago. I shook my head, still feeling the rush of courage from leaving her disapproval behind as I answered, "Thanks, but I've decided I'll get my own dress for the wedding." The silence, thick and uncomfortable, tangled in the air between us as I could feel the tension coil tighter, her eyes flaring momentarily with disbelief before rolling into disappointment. She sighed heavily, as if the weight of disappointment in me bore down, and while I once sought her approval, this rejection tasted different. It felt like freedom. I floated to the store entrance, my heart racing but my mind clearer than it had been in weeks, and when I bought the dress on my own terms, I felt like I was taking a bold step into the future instead of shying away from past shadows. Yet in the days leading up to the wedding, I could feel her gaze lingering, a cold prickling on my back as if she were waiting for the right moment to unleash her disappointment, and I braced myself as those wedding bells chimed. When the day finally came, I felt invincible as I pulled that emerald dress over my body, my reflection glowing with defiance. I triumphed through the crowd, my dad beaming with pride, yet behind me, I could sense my mom's silence. That characteristic sharpness in her smirk was nowhere to be found. As the vows exchanged resonated before us, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere deep down, spite lingered in that corner of her heart. Maybe she thought I'd regret standing up for myself, but as I took in the twinkling lights and the wild laughter around me, I knew I wouldn't take that confidence back for anything. The reception was euphoric until, just before it crescendoed, I caught my mother's eyes across the room. She approached, and the air thickened as tension crackled between us. "You really should have let me help you pick something more flattering," she murmured, a thin smile resting on her face but a storm brewing in her expression. My heart raced, and for a moment, I felt the girl I used to be creeping back, whispering to shrink under her disdain, but I wasn't having it. Channeling everything I felt the moment I decided to reclaim my story, I stated firmly, "No, Mom. This is who I am, and if you can't support me, then maybe I was right to buy my own dress after all." She hesitated, an army of emotions flashing through her eyes, and in that moment, I saw both loss and fear mingling with something close to admiration. As the music filled the room and laughter broke around us, I felt the sharp edges of my insecurities dulling, transforming into an armor I never knew I needed. We could stand in the tension of our differences, or I could embrace the freedom that came with walking away from the need for her approval. I walked away from her then, joining my friends who were twirling joyfully under the fairy lights, a smile bursting anew as I danced beneath the stars, and while I could still feel her distant gaze, it didn't pierce through my newfound strength. It simply faded into the background, a reminder that sometimes, to find yourself, you must sever the chains holding you to hurtful expectations, and in that moment, I wasn't just wearing an emerald dress, I was wearing the knowledge that I was enough, just as I am. I never thought a weekend getaway with my boyfriend and his family would leave me questioning my sanity, but here we are, with the shadows of the house enveloping me like a dark quilt of dread. It started innocently enough, with laughter filling the cozy air of his parents' cabin in the woods. We were greeted with warm hugs and the promise of memorable times, but as night fell, something felt off. The first evening, everything seemed fine, the arrangements were simple, two couples sleeping in respective bedrooms, and I felt comfortable nestled next to my boyfriend. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that his brother, Aaron, and his wife, Tara, were being overly favorable. They had just had a baby, which in turn shifted the dynamics. Everyone seems to tiptoe around them, as if their new little bundle of joy had installed an invisible hierarchy. The next morning, while I made coffee in the dim light of the kitchen, I overheard whispers in the living room, Aaron and Tara discussing how much easier they'd sleep in their own space and how much they appreciated the flexible accommodations this weekend. My mind raced. Flexible? I felt a lump form in my throat. We had less privacy because they brought their newborn, but nobody had bothered to consider how it would affect us. That night, I realized the sleeping arrangements had shifted again. Instead of sharing the queen bed in the guest room with my boyfriend, he was being shuttled to the living room sofa by his parents, while Aaron and Tara insisted on taking the guest room for the sake of the baby. The indignation rose in me like bile, and I couldn't hold back. When we gathered around the dinner table, I drew a deep breath and questioned why our plans had changed. "I thought we were supposed to share the guest room," I probed, venom drenching my words despite my best efforts. His parents exchanged knowing glances, and I could feel tension crackling in the air like static. "Ah, sweetheart, we made accommodations for Aaron and Tara. You understand, right?" My boyfriend's mother, Brenda, responded in that sugary tone meant to placate, but I tasted the bitterness. "No, I don't understand. We're all adults here, I don't see why their sleeping arrangement takes precedence." My voice was louder than I intended, and every pair of eyes locked onto me, filled with a mix of shock and disbelief. "Tara is nursing," Aaron's voice broke through like ice, sharp and accusing. "What do you expect us to do?" Suddenly, the laughter of earlier seemed like a distant memory, and the room became thick with unspoken words and judgment. The dinner turned into an awkward game of silence, heavy and foreboding, and I felt utterly alone despite being surrounded by family. Yet, the more I stewed in my indignation, the more I longed for clarity, for some shred of acknowledgement that the unfairness was real. As darkness enveloped the cabin, I lay curled around the edges of myself, silence stalking me like a predator, and I could hear the soft cooings of the baby and the muffled laughter of the others in the living room. I slipped out into the hallway, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet, frustrated and lost. I could hear my boyfriend's breath beneath the sofa, as I tiptoed past the open guest bedroom, where the shadows cast by the nightlight danced ominously across the walls. The room felt cursed, a trap designed to keep me from reclaiming my sanity. It was then that I overheard a conversation drifting from the living room, cloaked in laughter and familiarity. "She really needs to mind her place," Brenda said, and each of her words felt like a knife cutting into me. "I just don't know why we're coddling her. It's not like she's family." My heart dropped like a stone in a well, the implications crashed over me, and suddenly, the realization that I was considered other in this family simmered under my skin. I mustered the courage and stepped back into their world, a world painted in shades of favoritism and bias. "Why am I being pushed aside?" I demanded, standing firm despite the quaking in my voice. The laughter halted, and all eyes swung toward me. I'm not asking for special treatment, I just want to be treated equally. They shifted uncomfortably as I forced them to confront the truth that hung in the air, thick as fog. I could see the irritation flare in Aaron's eyes, while Tara remained quietly smug, nursing their sweet little privilege. You're overreacting, Brenda scoffed, and I could feel heat coursing through my veins, a bubbling cauldron of adrenaline. No, I'm fighting for fairness, I shot back, feeling a strange empowerment surge within me. The tension unraveled as Aaron slammed his fist on the table, rising to meet me, his face flushed with anger. You think you deserve something special just because you're dating our brother? Get real. It felt like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, I regretted voicing my frustrations, until I saw the conflict brewing behind my boyfriend's eyes. I could tell he was torn, caught between the impulse to defend me and the suffocating loyalty to his family that had been drummed into him since he was little. Finally, instead of collapsing under the weight of their cruel laughter, I turned my back on the room and marched out towards the exit. I needed air, fresh and untarnished, away from the clutches of their toxicity. As I reached the front porch, the moon hung low, bathing everything in a silvery hue that strangely felt like a blessing. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath of the fragrant pine, and my mind spun in circles, torn between loyalty and the burgeoning realization of who I am. Suddenly, the door behind me creaked open. I turned slowly to see my boyfriend standing there, a mix of shame and sorrow in his eyes. I'm sorry, he murmured, his voice shaky. I should have said something. But as he said it, I realized that words often mean nothing without action. And in that moment, wrapped in the solitude of darkness, I understood something terrifying. I was the outsider here. You can't apologize if you don't mean it, I said, my heart breaking with every syllable. His face fell, and the heaviness of my own truth rooted me to the spot. I wanted to run but instead felt the weight of the world on my shoulders as realization sank in. What was I, if not a mere guest in a house that should have felt like home? But as the night unfolded, the silence became a canvas where I painted the chilling realization: sometimes the truth is that you don't belong, even when love is tangled in the mess. And as my feet pushed me away from the cabin, echoes of their laughter haunting my ears like shadows, I knew I had crossed a line that was never meant to be crossed, and the darkness of the woods became my only solace as they faded into the background, leaving me to navigate the twisted path of life alone. I never thought a simple time test could spiral into a living nightmare, but here we are, and I need to share what happened before it consumes me entirely. My husband, Aaron, has always been my biggest supporter, or at least that's what I believed until last week. With finals approaching, I dedicated a Saturday to prepare for my final exam, the kind worth a significant chunk of my grade. I set up in our small bedroom, a dimly lit space that was usually filled with warmth but felt claustrophobic under the pressure of looming deadlines. I had placed my phone on Do Not Disturb, drowning out the world, steeling my will against distractions, and I was well into a practice test when I heard the faint creaking of the door. I wasn't sure whether it was my mind playing tricks on me or a genuine sound breaking my concentration. I told myself I was just imagining it and pressed ahead. The clock was ticking. I could feel my heart rate sinking with its relentless countdown. Just as I reached a particularly tricky question, the door swung open wider than expected, and there stood Aaron, his face an unreadable mask. He didn't knock, he didn't even wait for me to acknowledge him. He simply walked in and, without a word, grabbed the empty coffee cup from my cluttered desk, which wouldn't have been a big deal under normal circumstances, but in that moment, it felt like the ultimate betrayal. I exploded, shouting for him to get out and that I was in the middle of an important test. The look on his face morphed into confusion and hurt, making me feel worse almost instantly, yet a primal anger surged in me, an instinctive need to protect my focus at all costs, and I didn't realize I had crossed a line. Aaron backed away as if struck, retreating without another word, and I immediately regretted my outburst. It was never my intention to hurt him, but in the throes of tension, I was blind to everything else. Shaking, I tried to refocus, but the heaviness of my guilt loomed larger than any countdown timer. When I finally returned to the living room post-test, my heart sank deeper. The usually vibrant space felt hollow, too quiet, with tension hanging thick in the air. "Aaron?" I called hesitantly, my voice a small echo against the silence. No answer. I felt a cold dread seep into my bones. I checked the kitchen, the bathroom, and then the spare room, but each corner of our home held only emptiness. Panic tightened my throat as I grabbed my phone, ready to text him, but just as I was about to fire off a message, I noticed my notifications lighting up. The group chat with my classmates was flooded with frantic messages. Did you hear about Aaron? I can't believe it, they were right near the corner. And then the most chilling of them all, they said his car is gone. My heart dropped as a gnawing realization settled in. They were talking about the car accident in the news, and my mind raced with desperate images of a twisted metal heap, my husband a possible victim, consequences of his day spiraling out of control for reasons I couldn't fathom. I raced to the living room TV, where a breaking news segment flickered to life, reporters framed by flashing lights, and there was Aaron's car smashed against a tree, completely unrecognizable. They were saying something about speed, a reckless driver, and I felt the world around me shatter anew with every word. Somehow, I remained stuck in my own head, trapped between the anger I felt moments earlier and the fear gripping me now, unable to disentangle from the chaos I had already created. It was my fault. I had shut him out during a moment of sheer panic, blinded by my own selfish needs. I dropped to the floor, tears streaming down my face as guilt twisted into a knot in my stomach. What if he didn't make it? What if my voice had been the last thing he heard? I couldn't bear the thought. I grabbed my things and raced out the door, my heart pounding like a war drum against my ribcage as I sped toward the hospital, weaving through traffic with reckless abandon. Every red light felt like a ticking clock reminding me that I may have lost the only person who meant anything to me. When I finally made it to the ER, a haze of white coats and muffled voices surrounded me, and I stumbled onto a nurse who stopped me, her face a mask of professionalism that seemed utterly indifferent, and my gut twisted with urgency. "Please, where is he?" The nurse looked down and spoke carefully, almost as if she were preparing to shatter whatever shred of hope re-entered my heart. "You'll need to wait, ma'am. We're doing everything we can." I felt my heart drop into the depths of despair as the minutes turned into hours, each tick of the clock a cruel reminder of my own actions. The waiting area morphed from an ordinary space into a suffocating chamber of dread where guilt gnawed at my insides, replaying our last moments together like a broken record. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a doctor appeared, and my soul practically leapt into my throat. "He's stable," she said cautiously, "but he's unconscious. You can see him, but..." She paused, and the world around me faded out for a moment. "It's serious." The words felt like ice as I walked into the stark hospital room, seeing Aaron there, hooked to machines, wires snaking around him, face bruised and battered. Reality collided with my trauma, crashing into me with violent force. I approached the bed, heart heavy with emotion, wishing I could take back everything, shouting, turning away. I gently took his hand, squeezing it tightly as if my life depended on it. "I'm so sorry, Aaron. I never wanted this. I had no idea how much I needed you until I almost lost you." Tears continued to flow freely as I sat there, whispering to him, pouring out all the love and regret that had built up inside me. As days turned into a week, the fragile threads of hope began to weave through the darkness, and Aaron slowly started to regain consciousness. The first time his eyes fluttered open, dread coursed through me. What would he say? Would he hate me? I couldn't face that possibility. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't remember the fight, praying my words had reached him somehow. He turned his head slightly, squinting at the harsh fluorescent lights before his gaze fell on me, bewilderment etched across his face. "What happened?" He managed to croak, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of relief mixed with dread as I prepared to answer. This moment felt pivotal, but in his eyes, I saw forgiveness, possibly a reflection of my own guilt. Maybe he could sense the crushing weight of my regret, or maybe it was just the haze of pain killing every harsh thought. All I could do was nod and squeeze his hand tighter, letting the tears flow. "You got into an accident," I said softly. "You're here now. Just focus on getting better." We had a long road ahead of us, and in that uncertain future lay the lessons of a nightmarish reality, one that had shaken our lives and reminded me of the fragility of every moment we take for granted. It's wild how quickly everything can change, how a simple act of frustration in an innocent moment can lead us to the brink before bringing us back in character-shattering ways. It was in those darkest hours that I realized it was never about the test, but rather the love and understanding we have to nurture. Life is too unpredictable. I vowed never to take him for granted again. So, am I the asshole for shouting at him during a time test? I'm not sure if that label matters anymore. I never thought I'd find myself in a situation like this, the kind that felt ripped straight from the pages of a dystopian novel, marred with shades of gray and uncertainty, and the darkness that lurked just out of sight. My daughter, Hannah, has always danced on the edges of life, a brilliant but misunderstood 15-year-old laboring under the weight of what I thought was autism, her unique quirks, the way she'd chatter about dinosaurs to anyone who would listen, her anxiety sudden like whispers in the wind. My heart broke for her in the cruel world of teenagers, and I encouraged her to embrace her differences, to find beauty in her peculiarities. So, when I overheard her mention her autism to her friends in what I thought was a proudly defensive way, a cute little quirk she believed made her special, my gut clenched with an unsettling tightness. Inviting them over for a study session seemed harmless enough, but when I saw the way they wrapped around her, smothering her with assurances, it drove something chaotic and protective in me to burst out. I never meant for it to escalate, but suddenly I was standing in front of them, my voice defeating the friendly laughter and chatter, declaring that she wasn't autistic. The room thickened with discomfort, and I could see Hannah's face twist into the kind of hurt that sends an icy hand straight through a parent's heart, her friends looking between us like toddlers caught in a watered-down horror movie. The air crackled with something unnameable, and I could see it all unravel, how I had gotten it wrong, or maybe the world had twisted it, maybe I was condemning her to confusion, gaslighting her to fit my expectations, but each word tumbled out of my mouth against the creeping, gnawing terror misfiring in my brain. What if I was wrong? My daughter shrank into herself, her friends standing like frozen statues as I mentally backpedaled, desperately searching for words that could unring the bell of my rash outburst. I tried to explain, autism had never been verified, we had gone through evaluations, and I thought we were just on the edge of understanding her better. I pleaded with the space to breathe again, yet Hannah had already darted past me, eyes filled with something frighteningly close to betrayal, into the upturned laughter of her friends. I could hear the mumbles beneath the laughter, she can't even own her truth, maybe she is just weird, and the guilt sank in deeper than any regret I'd ever felt. Was I trying to protect her from the label, or was I just afraid of what that label might mean for me? As I stood there with my words hanging like a noose, I could feel the dread creep in like a fog, thickening with every second as I recalled darker days, missing the boundary of her laughter where I thought she was comfortable with her identity. I tried to grasp for a semblance of control over the chaos spinning into reality. Panic bubbled in my throat. I wanted to run after her, hold her, explain that I'd love her no matter what, but my phone buzzing in my pocket reminded me there are always consequences to every action. The school counselor calling, each ring a reminder piercing through me. If only I had the words that day, maybe she wouldn't have bolted outside, and maybe the shadows I feared wouldn't have been stirred up at all. The call didn't land fortuitously, it landed like a slap, announcing a meeting that I was supposed to attend to address the teacher's concerns about the transition Hannah was undergoing, entering high school, and the interactions it birthed. I paced the dim hall of our home, anxiety wrapping around my thoughts like a chokehold. I knew what they were going to say, potential loss of funding for her IEP, the looming sense of suspicion that somehow, I was mishandling this brilliant, fragile creature. Hours passed, and dread infused my silence, until finally, I heard her voice wavering outside, moments before her friends were to leave, their chatter growing distant, and then silence settled like a stone. I couldn't bear the thought of facing her unprepared, my mind a storm, the aftermath of my reckless act sitting between us. I walked tentatively to her room, where the door lay ajar, shadows dancing eerily under the flickering light of her desk lamp. She was sitting against her wall, tablet in hand, lost in the glare of the screen, a world far removed from me. "You don't understand anything," she shouted when the door creaked open, resentment wrapped around her words so tightly I felt it brush against my skin. You just want to fit me in a box." I tried to engage her, to tell her what I felt in the pit of my heart, that I was trying to protect her, to shield her from a world that could be unnervingly cruel. But words only poured out, like tongues of fire, igniting our conversation into a full-blown war of truths, half-truths, and fear, all wrapped around the question that haunted us, AITA for trying to define her existence based on something I had convinced myself to believe was in her best interest. As I listened to her cry, feeling that empty sentiment seeping into every crack of my resolve, I realized it wasn't merely the labels but the isolation we both hungered to escape. We were spiraling into a chasm, too deep for either of us to grab hold of the edge. Time blurred until it felt distorted, like watching a movie play out on a wall with others looking in, and in those frantic minutes, I lost sight of how to untangle the lie I'd created over fear, how to repair a fracture that threatened to turn my sweet daughter into someone unrecognizable. Our truths collided violently, and despair coiled tight around my chest until clarity hit harder than any revelation I had ever known. The only way out of this was through her, through listening and understanding, no matter how terrifying that felt, no matter the shockwaves that would ripple through my own perception of her identity. So I knelt on the floor beside her, fingers trembling like my resolve, and whispered, "I'm so sorry, Hannah. I want to understand you. I want you to know you're perfect just the way you are, no labels, just you. Please help me." But even as I said those words, I could feel shadows swirling in the corners of my mind. What if the thing I feared most had already begun to deposit itself into the very fabric of our lives? What if this small fracture between us was just the start of something darker to come? As peripheries blurred and fear turned to ice, loneliness stretched unrelentingly, and I held my breath, hoping that this time, it would heal rather than destroy us. When I was a little girl, I dreamt of my wedding day with a fervor that would make even the most hard-hearted cynical adult roll their eyes, and if you had asked me then, I would have told you that my dream dress was a breathtaking pink gown, the kind that twirled like cotton candy beneath layered lights at sunset. Fast forward to my engagement, and my fiancé, Derek, was everything I could ask for. His smile lit up my world, and his laughter felt like home. But when I finally unveiled my cherished vision of a pink wedding dress to him, the look on Derek's face fell faster than I could catch it. He chuckled, which only deepened the crease across his brow. I pictured white, you know. Traditional. For the photos. As if my heart hadn't already begun to sink, I tried to brush off his hesitation, assuring him that love was what mattered most, and pink could be the essence of our shared joy. I revisited the boutique alone, the walls decorated in thousands of hues of white, and there, hanging like a forgotten story, was my original vision, a delicate pink dress, with a satin underlay that shimmered like the dawn. I slipped it on and stood before the mirror, and for the briefest moment, I felt perfect. I chose to go ahead with what my heart desired and marked the day with pink every step of the way, a pink cake, pink flowers, even pink shoes. What should have been a joyful time took a perilous turn when I announced those plans at our engagement party, where friends and family gathered, the city skyline glowing behind them. Family members gave polite claps, but I noticed my mother's jaw tighten and my grandmother's eyes narrow. What happened to the beautiful white wedding dresses? My mother questioned, her tone dripping with disapproval. It felt as if the air thickened, my smile wavering under the weight of their stares. Derek, after lagging behind with a muted expression, pulled me aside later, voicing his concerns in a hushed whisper, words about tradition and expectations spilling forth, drowning me in regret. "You know it's important to my family, right?" The doubt nestled itself in my stomach like a lead weight. My heart raced as he tried to convince me that I should reconsider, but it was too late to turn back. I was headfirst submerged in a sea of satin pink and deep disappointment. I had visions of our special day twisting like a terrifying dream I couldn't wake from, and the anxiety seeped into the planning, igniting late-night arguments that pushed him away from me instead of drawing us closer. The week before the wedding loomed like a storm cloud, the colors clashed so vividly with the black and white portrait of my future in-law's expectations. I couldn't sleep, the pink parasol and blush decorations filling every corner of my mind like quicksand. It was like a haunting chorus, and just before I drifted into a restless sleep, I found myself centered once more, a dreamlike image of walking down an aisle of happiness. All that mattered was our love and not the color of my dress. Then, on the day before the wedding, I received a message from my brother. "Mom and Dad are fighting. It's bad." A wave of dread washed over me as I found myself torn between my loyalty to my family and my heart's desire. The chasm widened between my decisions, and on the fateful morning, I donned my pink dress alone in the hotel suite, my mother's disapproval echoing like a ghost trapped between and among all the swirling laughter of pre-wedding chaos. The sight of myself sent adrenaline rushing through my veins. I did look beautiful. As the ceremony began, however, I spotted Derek's family, shoulders rigid and jaws tight. My heart sank further with every step that carried me into their line of sight. Their eyes, void of understanding, chased away the joyful spark I had longed for. By the time we exchanged vows in front of our loved ones, I felt a churning pit of anxiety in my stomach. I wished for one person to embrace me and validate my choices, and yet I found only silence from my family's corner. The flush of embarrassment was invaded further, creeping in like vines on ancient stone. After the ceremony, as we danced surrounded by a bittersweet haze of joy and resentment, my grandmother confronted me about my foolhardiness. "You won't honor tradition? On a day meant to bind your families?" Her words were like shards of glass, and I fought the urge to scream. I tried to defend my actions, a flimsy paper boat riding the turbulent waves of emotion, and soon the reception spiraled into chaos. Derek's voice pierced through the crowd, a mix of frustration and disappointment mirrored in his eyes as I stood before my family and his, my pink dress like bandages on wounds that would never heal. The noise blurred into a cacophony of judgment and misunderstanding, laughter stained with unceremonious rejection, and in that moment, I felt a distinct fracture forming. The tension thickened so much that it became impossible to navigate. The phone rang, breaking the anguished silence that shifted our worlds into turmoil. My father, voice tremulous, came hurtling into the room. "You need to come home. Now." Panic rose within me, as dread settled deep in my bones, an omen I couldn't escape. I thought about that pink dress, now drenched in symbolic blood. What was a celebration had become a battleground, leaving behind only the ruins of my dreams hanging like broken glass. When Derek saw the fear flashing in my eyes, he took my hand, pulling us away from their judging glares. "We'll make this right," he whispered, but I had no idea what that meant, whether our love could withstand the chaos we had unleashed. Yet a sliver of hope pierced through the shadows as we stepped beyond the threshold of acceptance and rejection, the pink fabric swirling around me, a whirlwind of sorrow and love intertwined. In those moments filled with disbelief, it became painfully clear that weddings shouldn't be a battlefield, yet here we found ourselves entrenched. Now a question ignited within: AITA for drama over a pink wedding dress? As I processed the fallout creeping into our lives, one thing was certain: it would take more than a color to define the love we were scrambling to salvage. I never thought I'd be the one caught in a tug-of-war over life and death, but when my father chose to prioritize his fiancée's surgery over my own, I couldn't help but feel like a ghost haunting the edges of his life. The moment I was diagnosed with a rare heart condition, everything spiraled from familiarity to sheer panic. My required surgery was life or death, an urgent fix to a ticking time bomb inside me. My dad, who had always been both my rock and my tormentor, became distant as soon as his new fiancée entered the picture, an almost cartoonish figure with a flashy smile and an obsession with yoga that somehow transformed my father from the caring dad I remembered into an oblivious shell wrapped around her every whim. I still remember the day it all shattered. I had been staring at the sterile hospital ceiling with its bright lights flickering like the last breaths of hope when my father strolled in, a confident grin plastered on his face, oblivious to the storm brewing in my chest. "Guess what?" he exclaimed, shattering my concentration. "Diane finally got the necessary approval for her surgery. It's next week." My heart raced, not from excitement, because I knew my surgery was also scheduled for next week, meant to save me from the darkness lurking within. I stared at him, mouth dry and words tangled in my throat, my mind racing with confusion and anger. "What about my surgery, Dad?" I asked, my voice a tremor against the cold efficiency of the room. All he could muster was a casual wave of his hand, a gesture that felt like a dismissive slap to my very existence. "Summer, sweetie, Diane needs this. It's a tough procedure, and I want to be there for her." At that moment, it dawned on me that I was no longer the priority in his life. His fiancée was the one who needed nurturing, love, attention, everything I had hoped my father would give me as I faced the specter of death. The reality hit me like 1,000 tiny hammers. He chose her over me, and I felt discarded, like a broken toy with no real value. I spent the days leading up to my surgery in limbo, wondering how blood could run thicker than water when mere affection had suddenly paled in comparison to a woman who gained my father's affection only recently. I didn't understand how he could be so blind, so utterly subsumed by her charm that he neglected the urgency of what was at stake, his own flesh and blood. On the day of the operation, nurses wheeled my gurney down the long, sterile hall, and as I passed the waiting area, I spotted him. He sat there, hand clasped over hers, laughing at something she said, laughing at the uncertainties of life, completely oblivious to my imminent fate. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, not with fear of the surgery but with rage and betrayal. They were just at the other end of the hallway, and as I was rolled on by, the moment felt like a goodbye, like I was surrendering myself to the uncertain void, pushed aside for someone who had only stepped into the picture months before. I woke up in recovery, groggy and disoriented, feeling as though I had been torn from one world and thrown into another. Dazed, I scanned the room, hoping against hope to see my dad. Instead, only an empty chair remained. I called out to a nurse, my voice cracking, feeling abandoned and lost, needing comfort, just wanting to know I mattered, that I was worth fighting for. She offered a sympathetic smile and squeezed my hand gently. "He's with Diane, dear. She had a complication in her procedure." Those words struck me like a thunderous drum, the realization that I could have been lying in a casket, my father by her side, his heart beating for her while mine lay cold. The pain morphed inside me. It was no longer just physical but a fiery bitterness. I didn't care how selfish I sounded, I was allowed to feel anger at the man who chose someone else over his own daughter. Days merged together, and every time I found the strength to look for my dad, he was still there with her, spinning tales of shared laughter while I lay bruised and silent in the hospital. When we finally spoke, I confronted him, my emotions overflowing like a flood, raw and unrestrained. "You chose her, Dad. You chose her over me," I said, tears streaming down my face. "You took her side, and I was alone." The silence that followed was the sharpest knife through my heart. A slow realization washed over him, but all I saw reflected back was disbelief. "No, it wasn't like that," he shouted, his voice thick with panic. "You're my daughter. You know that." But the words rang hollow, echoes drifting into the void where our bond had once thrived. I left the hospital feeling like I had lost more than my father. I had lost the last semblance of family I clung to, my will to fight diminished by someone who never cared to unravel the damage she had caused. Days turned into weeks, and news of Diane's shaky recovery filled my dad's voice every chance he got while still making excuses for his absence in my life. When I learned she was finally stabilized, I confronted my dad one last time. "You have to make a choice," I whispered, my heart racing as adrenaline coursed through me. "It's either me or her. You can't have both, not while I'm fighting for my life and she's taking everything from me." His face paled, and for the first time, I saw clarity in him, as if my words had finally threaded through the fog surrounding his mind. But instead of answering, he looked away, avoiding my gaze, and my heart shattered all over again. It was then I realized, the true betrayal wasn't his choice to love someone else, it was a choice he would always make, to love her more. Walking away from him that day felt like my own funeral, a weight lifting from my chest as I stepped into the cold air, a marionette severed from its strings. So, yeah, AITA for telling my dad he made a choice between me and his fiancée when he prioritized her surgery over mine? I don't think so. I just wanted him to see that he wasn't the only one who knew what it felt like to stand at the crossroads of life, and without him there to choose me, I simply had to learn to choose myself. When my fiancé, Tom, and I decided to move into our first home together, I imagined the smiles, laughter, and warmth we would fill it with, but everything changed the day I voiced my concern about his cousin's girlfriend, Clara. Clara had always rubbed me the wrong way, her laughter too loud, her words too cutting, and one particularly unsettling memory of a family barbecue haunted me. She cornered me, her cold eyes glinting with mischief, and whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear, about my past struggles with anxiety, painting me as some fragile, broken person. I brushed it off back then. Family dynamics can be complex, and feigned a smile while the red crept up my neck. But as moving day approached, I felt a creeping dread about the idea of her plopping on our new couch, treating our space like her personal stage. So, in an attempt to safeguard our peace, I brought it up to Tom, explaining how uncomfortable it made me to think she'd feel entitled to our home, that I just didn't want her to bring her drama and condescension into this new chapter of our lives. To my shock, he looked at me like I'd slapped him, his brows knitted in confusion, as he insisted that family gatherings were meant to be inclusive, and Clara was part of that family, and somehow it spiraled into a heated argument where he accused me of being controlling, selfish, not understanding the importance of his family to him, and in that moment, I felt the weight of isolation as he doubled down on inviting her, claiming I was overreacting, that I was the one causing a rift between us. I found myself in the eye of a storm I couldn't comprehend, where my feelings meant nothing, and he chose blood over the woman he was supposed to love most. It shattered me, and I felt like a villain in my own life, a true the fiancé versus the cousin's girlfriend tale playing out in a twisted sense of irony, and I thought of the odd glances she wouldn't hesitate to throw at me whenever Tom wasn't around, her calculated remarks piercing like daggers, but I kept quiet. When moving day arrived, the last thing I wanted was conflict, so I plastered on a smile and welcomed the chaos that came with a dozen family members stepping over boxes and trailing dirt onto our floors, but deep down I could feel that storm brewing. I'd already warned Tom, hadn't I? As the day unfolded, the house buzzed with laughter and chatter, and amidst the crowded living space, there appeared Clara, strutting in like she owned the place, her outfit representing some twisted version of classy. I felt an unsettling heaviness in my chest, and I excused myself to the kitchen for a moment of sanity, hoping a few deep breaths could drown out the noise. I poured myself a glass of water, feeling the cold glass against my sweaty palm when suddenly Clara appeared at the door, leaning against the frame with that same mocking grin. "Aren't you tired of pretending to be the perfect fiancé? Or does he not mind that you're really just a little weirdo?" she said, taking a deliberate step closer as if to intimidate me. Panic bubbled within me, and all the moments I had held back came flooding to the surface. I blurted out that she was unwelcome in our home. Silence. The kitchen, once filled with the scent of garlic and roasted chicken, turned so still it felt like I had yanked out the air from the room. Time slowed as her expression shifted, eyes narrowing, lips curling into a smirk tinged with malice. "You really think a little boundary will save you? This is not just your house, this is our family, dear," she hissed, emphasizing the word "our" with venom that sent chills down my spine. It was at that moment, watching her intense gaze penetrate through my facade, that I realized I had inadvertently wedged myself deep into a battle I was bound to lose. The wall between us felt insurmountable, and when I finally emerged from that kitchen, it was to a scene that felt surreal. Tom caught in a web of confusion and frustration as Clara spilled the beans about our little confrontation. The smiles turned into whispers as a funeral-like hush descended over our guests. I could see some looking at me in pity, others stunned, and the dagger of humiliation plunged deeper into my already frayed nerves. It felt like I was standing on a precipice, the ground trembling beneath me, and in a split second of sheer panic, I realized I was not the only one threatened by this shattering tension. Tom's eyes flashed with anger, disappointment, and betrayal, and before I could explain, I felt the cold weight of the room's judgment tighten around my throat. He turned to me, voice low and trembling. "Why would you do that? Why would you make a scene?" It struck me like a slap in the face, heartbreaking because this wasn't about me being the focus of the drama. I had only been trying to set the stage for a peaceful beginning, so why couldn't he see that? Determined to resolve the chaos, I tried justifying my feelings, asserting my need for boundaries, but all I got in return was the flicker of anger in his eyes, a refusal to understand. Clara was still smirking, her victory evident as she leaned back against the wall, arms crossed, soaking in every moment of my humiliation. I felt as if I was the intruder in my own life, torn between my love for Tom and the need for self-respect, my very existence reduced to a battle over territory, and I finally spoke the truth, that I wasn't comfortable with Clara slipping in and out of our lives like she was a part of the furniture, and that anger transformed into terrible isolation as Tom stepped back, shaking his head, whispering that I didn't know how to play nice with family, that I would always be an outsider to his world. The words pierced deeper than anything Clara could have said. I stood there, wrestling with waves of despair, realizing the nightmare was not just her presence but the fact that I was losing him. It felt surreal in the aftermath as people hovered awkwardly, unsure whether to support me or defend him, the tension strangling the air, collapsing my hopes of love into ashes. I tried to refuse Clara's smug smile, but the reality sunk in like the darkness gathering around me. This was never going to end well, and as the night dragged on, I watched Tom grow more frustrated, more distant, and I realized that in trying to stand my ground, I had unwittingly dug a grave for our relationship, slowly trapped in a dissonance that had settled over both our lives, one that made me question if I was the villain or merely a puppet pulled by strings of a vengeful fate. Now the boundaries blurred, and all I could wish for was to rewind. Instead, I found myself waking up in our new home alone the next morning, losing sight of the dreams I once had, staring at the walls which felt less like comfort and more like a cage filled with memories of regret, uncertain whether Tom would choose to fight for us or slide into the shadows, where Clara lurked, waiting to further her twisted campaign against the fragile remnants of what remained of our love. I never thought I'd be the one to ruin the holidays, but I guess that's what happens when your family decides you're the villain. It all started when Mom began to forget things, small things at first, like where she placed her knitting needles, but soon it escalated to missing important appointments and repeating stories just minutes apart. By the time the doctors finally agreed it was Alzheimer's, we were already deep into the annual holiday preparations, every single corner of the house smelling like cinnamon and pine, a stark contrast to the dread that settled in my stomach. My siblings and I had been discussing Mom's care for months, but every time we brought it up, Dad would brush us off, insisting she was just going through a phase. So, there we stood at the kitchen table that year, stuffing our faces with sugar cookies, debating the reality in front of us while Dad played Christmas music a little too loud to ignore the seriousness of the conversation. We finally decided it was time to take action. My sister and I felt like we had no choice but to push Dad to consider a long-term care facility, a decision that would forever alter the dynamics of our family. After weeks of pushing and arguing, we managed to find a place, one that seemed warm and welcoming, tucked away near a lovely, serene park. I'll never forget the look on Mom's face the day I took her there. It was a mix of confusion and unease, like she was suddenly stuck in a world unfamiliar to her. Sure, there were moments that broke my heart, when I heard her mumble under her breath about wanting to go home, or the way her hands trembled as she reached out for mine while we were walking through the facility's garden. Still, I convinced myself that it was the best decision for her. I didn't realize how my family would react until the holidays arrived. We gathered around the dinner table, laughter bouncing off the walls like the spirited carols playing in the background, but every joke fell flat when someone brought up Mom being in the facility. The looks exchanged, disapproving, hurt, cut deeper than any knife could. "You had to put her in there, huh?" My brother scoffed, mimicking the tone of someone relaying gossip, making a joke out of something that felt raw and broken. I asked him how he thought we could keep up with her needs when we could barely manage our own lives, and in response, he slammed his fists on the table, sending a glass of wine flying off the edge for it to shatter against the floor, the sound echoing in my ears like a tolling bell. Christmas night turned into a disaster. Dad left the table early, mumbling something about being sick, and my brother followed him, grumbling about how things used to be. My sister sat there, seemingly unaffected, but I could see the tears threatening to spill. I felt like I had placed a rift in our family's foundation, and it was my fault. By the time the clock struck midnight, I was alone in the kitchen, scrubbing the remnants of that holiday meal, staring at my reflection in the darkened window. It was surreal watching myself shift from a devoted daughter into some distorted version attacking her own flesh and blood. That's when I heard it, soft, muffled whispers drifting from the living room where my family was gathered. Curiosity piqued, I leaned against the wall, straining to hear their words as well as the melancholy sound of the music filtering through the air. "I miss Mom, she was the glue," my sister said, her voice thick with emotion. "This isn't the way it's supposed to be." I stood frozen, panic swelling inside until I couldn't suppress it any longer. I was about to turn away when I heard my brother's voice, low and menacing, cutting through the sorrow. "She wrecked Christmas. We'll never forgive her." His words stung, and the darkness began to swell, an ugly, gnawing sensation crawling along my spine. For weeks after, all I heard from my siblings were passive-aggressive remarks about how I was to blame. They'd thrown holiday gatherings minus me, told stories that excluded any mention of Mom's current state, effectively rewriting history to make it look as though I wasn't even a part of this family anymore. I could have handled that, dealt with their hostility, but what I couldn't prepare for was that one icy January night a blizzard hit, forcing them to call me. Mom had fallen and needed to be rushed to the hospital. I couldn't breathe as I drove through the blinding snow, my heart racing faster than my car skidding across the icy roads. Arriving at the hospital, I was met with a wall of tension. My brother stood at the entrance, shoved his hands deep into his pockets, avoiding any eye contact, while my sister's eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, the stress and guilt weighing down on all of us. When the doctor finally emerged with a grim expression, it became painfully clear, I'd made the worst decision of my life. Mom had pneumonia. The long-term care facility had been negligent, failing to monitor her properly, allowing her state to worsen while we sat at home, too caught up in our family drama to notice. Standing in the stark waiting room, all the blame came crashing down on me like an avalanche. I was the villain in this warped version of our holiday story, and now, I held the key to her life in my hands. Days stretched into an eternity, and every minute was filled with tension. My siblings and I watched her fight for breath, whispering stories of how she used to bake cornbread on chilly afternoons or read us bedtime stories until we nodded off, hoping that somehow reaching into a happy past might bring back the woman we loved. Then, in a moment that felt both exhilarating and terrifying, her eyes opened briefly, and for a fleeting second, I swear I saw the spark of recognition, a glimmer of the warm, loving Mom I had known slowly fading. But just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, her breath becoming shallow as our family crumbled around her. A few weeks later, Mom was discharged, but she was not the same, lost in a fog of confusion and fear, like a wisp of smoke dissolving into the air. We decided to take her home, feeling that maybe familiarity would assist her recovery. As we settled into a grim routine, the guilt twisted deeper, roughening our laughter, suffocating our joy, and turning family moments into reminders of what we lost that fateful day I made an impossible choice. If anything good emerged from our turmoil, it was that my siblings and I finally united under an unspoken oath to never let the past repeat itself. We'd always check in on one another, foregoing the blame and the name-calling in the spirit of family. Yet the shadow of that holiday still hung over me, unrelenting and bitter, a chilling reminder of how a seemingly small decision, placing my mom in a facility, had led to our family's unraveling. We may not fully understand our roles in the eulogy of what once was, but I know one thing for certain: the holidays became unbearable, each year a haunting reminder of lost moments, with our lingering guilt festering into a dangerous concoction of shared grief and blame that can either bind us together or tear us apart all over again. So now, as I sit here, secretly shaking and desperately holding on to the hope that we can find a way back to some semblance of love and happiness, I question, am I the asshole for wanting to reclaim my family during this holiday season, or am I just a prisoner to my own mistakes, forever banished from the warmth that was once our reality? I never thought a simple trip to the store would turn my life upside down, but here I am, staring at a deliberately cracked rearview mirror and my shaking hands as I replay that day like a broken record. It was a Thursday afternoon when I made my way to the local grocery store, the kind where you can already smell the fresh bread wafting through the air the moment you step inside. I parked my car, a rickety old hatchback that sometimes felt more like a death trap than a mode of transport, and grabbed my reusable bags, satisfied at the thought of stocking up on supplies for the week ahead. As soon as I stepped out into the sun, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, but I shrugged it off. I was just being paranoid. As I navigated through the aisles, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, I felt an odd sense of unease gathering in the pit of my stomach, like a storm gathering clouds, but the distraction of choosing ripe avocados kept me focused. Then, just as I was about to pay, the store manager, a burly man with a thick mustache, confronted me. He pointed an accusatory finger and demanded to know why I had parked in the customer parking lot despite being a non-customer. My heart sank as I stammered out an explanation, grappling for words to deny the absurd claim. The truth was, I had shopped there plenty before. I was a loyal customer even if I wore the same ratty hoodie every time. But he wasn't having it, and soon enough, a crowd gathered around us like vultures drawn to a dying animal, some taking pictures on their phones, others whispering behind their hands. I felt my face burn as outrage and embarrassment battled inside me. I tried to plead my case, but the manager's eyes were void of sympathy, and he kept saying I had stolen a space meant for paying customers, almost reveling in my unease. The chatter swirled around me, and through it all, I became acutely aware of the other customers' judgmental stares, their silent alliances forming against me. Just when I thought it couldn't get worse, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I whipped around to see a stranger who claimed to have witnessed everything. The wrinkle-faced woman looked deep into my eyes and said she had seen me walk into the store without a cart, evidence of my guilt, she implied. Before I knew it, I was in a full-blown confrontation, surrounded by angry voices as the scene devolved, and I felt trapped in a surreal nightmare where all I wanted was to grab my groceries and leave. I thought I would cry, the humiliation of it all, so I decided to cut my losses and walk away. But before I made it to the door, I heard a loud shout that made me spin. "You think this is okay? You think you can do whatever you want?" It was a younger guy. He must have been no older than 25, and he was practically shaking with rage. My instinct told me to just leave, yet I felt a compulsion to respond. "I can park anywhere that's not specifically marked," I said, my voice tinged with desperation. "I'm a customer." Somehow, the words fell flat, and within minutes, I felt like I was the villain in a crime thriller. People were snapping photos, and I couldn't help but feel like I was reshaping their perception of me into something monstrous and self-serving. Heavy with the risk of escalation, I bolted toward my car, but the crowd followed me, whispers morphing into accusations, and I could hear the word entitlement thrown around like a weapon. My shaking fingers struggled with the keys, the metal digging into my palm like the weight of the judgments surrounding me. In that moment, a primal panic kicked in, and I took off, barely managing to slam the door behind me before revving the engine. I glanced in my rearview mirror. The crowd dwindled, but still, those eyes followed me as I sped away, fueled by something more than just righteous indignation. I thought about what they believed of me, a thief in plain view, a villain unseen until I was thrust into the light. I had an incessant feeling of being stalked as I drove home, every car a possible threat, every intersection a heightened crossroads of shame. By the time I reached my neighborhood, the weight of my crime settled heavily on my shoulders, pulling my spirit down. I locked the door behind me, determined never to revisit that store again, but the fallout was far from over. Over the next few days, I watched anxiously as the topic spiraled on social media. Someone had posted a video of the confrontation, painting me as a monster in need of public scorn. The comments were merciless, people calling for my head because of a miscommunication blown out of proportion. I struggled to sleep. Images of that mob haunted me as I tossed and turned, each creak of the house sending jolting terror coursing through me. I tried to remain disconnected, but it was impossible to ignore the shame, the anger, and the community I thought I belonged to suddenly turning their backs on me. I stopped going out, avoiding the grocery store like it was a plague zone, but I still heard whispers as I passed others in my neighborhood. Then came the calls. I got them all right, late at night just as I was starting to succumb to the silence of my home. They were taunting, anonymous voices echoing the very accusations that had attacked me days prior. I blocked number after number, but they kept coming, like a relentless tide, washing over me, burying me in guilt for something I had believed was just a simple parking dispute. I no longer found joy in cooking for myself or curling up with a good book. All I felt in the pit of my stomach was an ever-gnawing shame that clung to me like a shadow, relentless and suffocating. I began to question my own sanity. Had I really parked illegally? Did my neighbor slip the manager my license plate? The whispers grew louder, and they felt like the predator closing in on its prey. Then one night it all came to a head. I found myself pacing the floor, drowning out the voices in my head. I had to know the truth. The next day, I ventured out once more, heart pounding like a drum but determined to confront my fears head-on. I needed to know if it was true or just a horrible delusion created by my escalating paranoia. I parked in a remote corner of the lot, hidden behind a line of bushes, and I watched as the store, the employees, the manager, the customers, all of them went about their business, seemingly unaware of the nightmare that they had thrust upon me. It was then that I saw her, the woman from that day, her eyes scanning the parking lot, locking once again on a car that was far from mine. I noticed something was off, a slight look of satisfaction overtaking her usually neutral expression as she walked toward the store. She turned and looked right in my direction, but I was smart enough to stay hidden. In that haunting moment, I understood, this was never about a parking lot. It was about a power struggle, a humiliation that they sought to inflict on someone who didn't fit their ideal of a perfect customer. I got back into my car and drove away, heart racing, but deep down I felt empowered. I finally had clarity of a sort. Perhaps I could never return to a place I loved, but now I knew, I was never going to be their scapegoat again. In lieu of acceptance, I chose to carve out my own reality, for whatever it was worth. As for the accusations, AITA. Well, maybe parking in that lot was the least of my sins, but now I'm focusing on how to rise from the ashes of a grocery store confrontation that left me feeling more human than ever.